Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a seriously dense, highly specific legal critique written by an author using the pseudonym Publius Custos. We're going to be looking closely at the Massachusetts Constitution and, well, the modern administrative state. Now, no matter your background in legal theory, this document is basically an incredible exercise in strict constitutional logic, and we're going to break it all down, step by step. Take a look at where this all starts. This is the source document we're analyzing today, published right in the Government Accountability Commission Law Review. Its central premise? A totally strict, uncompromising indictment of what the author actually calls systematic constitutional usurpation. The core argument here is that modern governments have fundamentally breached its original 1780 contract. Let's see exactly how they build that argument. Okay, let's dive right into this logical map. We've got four main stops today: the foundation of law, the fixed constitutional contract, the rules of delegation, and finally, the administrative state critique. First up, the foundation of law. To really grasp this critique, we actually have to rewind the timeline to before the government even existed. We need to look at the raw philosophy underpinning this whole argument. Now, the paper leans heavily into 18th century philosophy about where human rights actually come from. And it's perfectly captured by this Thomas Paine quote: "It is impossible to discover any origin of rights other than in the nature of man." Essentially, the author is saying that rights aren't just gifts handed down by the state, they are completely inherent to human existence itself. Let's completely dejargonize this. When we talk about natural law in this context, we're talking about inherent rights, things like life, liberty, and property. And the author, backed by thinkers like Friedrich Bastiat, argues that these are pre-state, pre-legal, and pre-political. Because we exist, we have them. And since individuals have a natural right to defend those endowments, government is literally just a collective organization created solely to defend those pre-existing rights. It supposedly has no other legitimate purpose whatsoever. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the visual hierarchy, what the author cleverly calls the Firewall of Law. It's an unbreakable stack. At the very top, you've got the law of revelation, followed by fundamental maxims, which are basically self-evident legal truths. Underneath that, constitutions, which the author dramatically describes as man's written cage for government. And finally, way at the bottom, your everyday enactments and statutes. So the argument goes that any modern statute has to pass through all these superior layers to be valid. If it contradicts a higher level, boom, it's not law. So if rights exist before the government even shows up, and government is just a tool to protect them, how do we lock those natural rights into place? How do we prevent that very tool from turning tyrannical? That brings us to Section 2, the fixed constitutional contract. It's a blueprint, not a draft. This is where we see the author's incredibly strict, entirely uncompromising view of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution. Looking at the preamble of the Massachusetts Constitution, the text here doesn't view this document as some flexible, breezy guideline. No, it views it as Thomas Jefferson's metaphorical chains. It's an explicit, highly limited job description that the sovereign people gave to the government. According to this theory, the government only gets the authority explicitly listed right here, and absolutely nothing more. The paper sets up a pretty stark contrast between two very different legal views. On one side, you have the fixed contract approach, where the meaning of the Constitution is locked in stone the second it's adopted, keeping power strictly limited. On the flip side is the living document view, allowing for evolving interpretation and ultimately expanding power. The author strictly aligns with legal scholars like Thomas M. Cooley and James Madison on this one, arguing that any living deviation from the strict letter of the parchment is basically an illegitimate scheme and effectively an act of tyranny. If the Constitution is a fixed, totally unbending contract, how exactly does the government acquire its lawful authority to do, well, anything on a daily basis? Let's look at the actual mechanics of how power gets transferred. Moving into Section 3, the rules of delegation, trust versus usurpation. Here, the author lays out rigid, immutable rules governing exactly how the sovereign people hand over power to their government agents. So the crucial point is that in this legal framework, there is absolutely no middle ground. Drawing on Thomas Paine again, the author presents a strict binary. First, there's delegated power, a lawful trust operating strictly within the prescribed limits. And then there is assumed power, which is any authority exercised without an express written grant. And the author defines assumed power simply as usurpation, no gray areas. The paper lays out 4 immutable rules of delegation. Let's translate these into plain English. First, you can't grant a power you don't actually possess. Second, delegated power cannot be redelegated. Meaning, for example, a legislature can't just hand off its core lawmaking job to unelected administrative agencies. Third, power can't exceed the original grant. And fourth, the inclusion of one thing excludes all others. Basically, if the Constitution doesn't explicitly say you can do it, you absolutely cannot. That brings us to a really critical legal concept in the paper, casus omissus. This basically means a matter intentionally omitted. The author argues that in constitutional law, silence is a strict jurisdictional prohibition. It's not an invitation to expand power. So just because a constitution is silent on, say, modern administrative tribunals, that doesn't mean they're allowed. Under strict construction, that silence means they are expressly forbidden. The omission is deliberate. All right, so we've established the underlying philosophy, the fixed contract, and the strict rules of delegation. So how exactly does the modern government measure up to these absolutely uncompromising standards? Let's get into the final section, the administrative state critique, agents in rebellion. This is where we hit the paper's explosive central critique of modern governance. The author points out that the Massachusetts legislature, the General Court, operates under 4 mandatory criteria directly from the Constitution. Laws have to be wholesome, reasonable, for the good of the Commonwealth, and not repugnant to the Constitution. The paper argues these aren't just polite suggestions, they are jurisdictional kill switches. Failing even one of these criteria makes a law void ab initio. That means it is entirely invalid from the very beginning, literally as if it never existed. Applying those super strict filters, we arrive at the author's ultimate claim, detailed here as findings of structural breach. The author neutrally but firmly asserts that the modern administrative state operates completely outside the constitutional contract. By blending legislative rulemaking, executive enforcement, and judicial hearings all within single administrative agencies, the government has basically bypassed the strict separation of powers required by that original 1780 text. To really illustrate the gravity of this strict constructionist viewpoint, the author cites Amar Devatel, who calls violating the Constitution a capital crime against society. The paper doesn't frame the creation of modern administrative agencies as progress. Instead, it frames it as a structural breach and a total forfeiture of the government's original executive commission. So what's the author's proposed solution to all this? They title it Restoration Without Rupture. It's basically a call for a peaceful, gradual reversion, moving away from modern administrative command and going straight back to the strict first principles of the 1780 constitutional limitation. It's a demand to dissolve what the authors views as systemic usurpation and strictly bind the government back into its original, written cage. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole thing, capturing the entire logical progression of the paper in one abstract. Step by step, the author builds from the inherent rights of natural law, establishes the Constitution as an unbending fixed contract, applies those rigid rules of delegation, and ultimately uses that exact framework to reject the modern administrative state as entirely unconstitutional. We've unpacked an incredibly dense, highly structured legal argument today. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder on your own. Has modern governance traded the safety of strict constitutional boundaries just for the convenience of administrative power? Can a 21st century state actually function within an uncompromising 18th century framework? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating legal critique with me.